Europe was told America was becoming impossible to love, so why are its biggest cities suddenly packed with Europeans again? During the 2026 World Cup, the sidewalks told a very different story. Full restaurants, crowded attractions, fans staying longer than planned, and visitors discovering a country that felt warmer, bigger, and far more enjoyable than the headlines suggested. What happens when the America people feared online becomes the America they do not want to leave? New York overflowing. By the time the 2026 World Cup summer reached New York, the old picture many Europeans had been handed about America began to look strangely incomplete. The city, they were told, was too chaotic, too expensive, too rough, too divided and somehow constantly on the verge of falling apart, was suddenly doing something inconvenient to that story. It was packed with visitors who had flown across the Atlantic voluntarily, filled its sidewalks, crowded its restaurants, queued for attractions, and then kept extending their days because there was still too much left to see. That contrast is exactly what makes New York such a powerful first stop in this story. European media coverage of the United States often concentrates on crime, political conflict, homelessness, or social tension because those subjects naturally dominate headlines. A headline, however, is a terrible tour guide. Once people are standing in Manhattan during a global event like the World Cup, the city becomes harder to reduce to a warning label. Midtown is still loud, traffic is still traffic, and nobody has secretly moved Times Square to a quiet village, but the energy feels less like collapse and more like one giant city refusing to go to bed. The cultural difference becomes even clearer when New York is placed beside cities such as Vienna or Copenhagen. Both are exceptionally livable cities, known for orderly public transport, controlled urban design, and a calmer everyday rhythm. New York operates with a completely different personality. It throws Broadway theaters, rooftop bars, 24-hour delis, basketball culture, immigrant neighborhoods, giant museums, and street food into the same few miles, then somehow expects everyone to keep walking, like this is perfectly normal. For a European visitor used to cities where evenings often settle into a more predictable pace, Manhattan after midnight can feel like discovering that somebody forgot to turn America off. That is where the affection often begins. American convenience can seem almost excessive until somebody actually needs it. A late meal is easy to find, a pharmacy can feel like a small supermarket. Portions sometimes arrive with the confidence of a Thanksgiving aunt who has decided you look underfed. Coffee is large enough to require emotional commitment, and service culture tends to be direct, energetic, and unusually attentive by the standards of many parts of Europe. None of this makes New York perfect, and nobody who lives there would pretend otherwise. The city has real problems, just as London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome do. What changes during a visit is the proportion. Once the noise of daily life replaces the noise of headlines, the United States stops looking like a collection of national problems and starts looking like a place where millions of ordinary people are working, eating, laughing, commuting, shopping, and welcoming visitors every day. That may be why New York becomes difficult to leave. Europeans arrive for football, landmarks, and a few famous photos, but many stay fascinated by something less photogenic: the sheer confidence of American urban life. The city moves as if there will always be another table, another show, another neighborhood, another conversation waiting around the corner. And during a World Cup summer with European accents filling sidewalks from Manhattan to Brooklyn, New York does not look like a country people are trying to escape. It looks like a place an awful lot of people are trying to experience before their flight home. Miami goes full summer. Miami during World Cup season has a funny way of making old stereotypes about America look badly underdressed. European visitors arrive expecting football, sunshine, and a few days near the water, then discover a city where leisure has been built with the same confidence Americans usually reserve for pickup trucks and Super Bowl halftime shows. The crowds spilling through South Beach, Brickell, and the waterfront are interesting, but the deeper story is why people seem so willing to stay outside, stay late, and keep adding one more day to the trip. Miami understands something that many European cities treat very differently. Vacation is allowed to take up space. Compare that with Barcelona, where some of Europe's most beautiful beaches sit directly beside a dense historic city and millions of residents share relatively compact public space. Or take Nice, where the Mediterranean waterfront is elegant, famous, and intensely walkable, but the urban experience remains tightly stitched together. Miami stretches the idea outward. The beach is wide, hotel complexes are large, roads are broad, restaurant terraces feel generous, and entire neighborhoods seem designed around the assumption that nobody came all this way to spend the evening staring at a hotel wall. That scale can look excessive from abroad until people start using it. South Florida's tourism economy has long depended heavily on international travel, and Miami International Airport has historically ranked among the busiest U.S. gateways for international passengers. Before the 2026 tournament, the region was already accustomed to receiving millions of overseas visitors annually. That matters because Miami does not treat foreign tourists like an unusual seasonal interruption. The city has spent decades learning how to absorb them into everyday life. This is where the culture becomes addictive. In parts of Europe, dining at 10 p.m. is perfectly normal, especially in Spain or Italy, but the American difference lies in how many other forms of convenience remain available around that late-night energy. Large supermarkets stay open late, restaurants serve enormous menus, rides are easy to arrange, air conditioning is treated almost as a constitutional right, and a single commercial district can combine shopping, food, nightlife, and entertainment without requiring an archaeological expedition through 5 tram connections. Even the weather becomes part of the joke. Northern Europeans may leave Manchester or Hamburg wearing layers and arrive in Miami to discover that the atmosphere feels like someone opened a dishwasher halfway through the cycle. 10 minutes later, they walk into a restaurant where the air conditioning could preserve a Thanksgiving turkey until Christmas. America somehow gives you tropical heat and indoor Wisconsin in the same block. Yet behind the comedy is something genuinely appealing. Comfort here is rarely embarrassed about itself. American culture often gets criticized abroad for being too large, too convenient, or too focused on consumption. Miami turns those supposed flaws into the very reason a holiday feels effortless. Space means families can spread out. Bigger hotels mean more amenities. Strong service culture means tourists do not need to apologize for asking questions. Long opening hours mean the day does not end simply because somebody forgot to make dinner reservations at 6. That is why the returning European crowds matter more than another postcard shot of palm trees. They suggest that when people experience America physically rather than through a newsfeed, the country becomes harder to dismiss. Miami does not need to argue with anyone about whether the United States is enjoyable. It simply hands them sunshine, a table outside, another cold drink, and enough room to decide for themselves. Vegas never sleeps. Las Vegas has a habit of ruining the scale on people's internal measuring tape. A European visitor can spend years hearing that Americans make everything bigger, then arrive on the Strip and realize the phrase was apparently meant as construction advice. Hotels contain thousands of rooms, digital screens climb entire buildings, restaurants behave like attractions, and a 5-minute walk on Google Maps can quietly become a small cardio session because the casino next door is roughly the size of a neighborhood. That oversized entertainment culture is the real reason Las Vegas belongs in this story. Europe has no shortage of glamorous nightlife. Monte Carlo built an international reputation around casinos and luxury long before Nevada became famous, while Ibiza can turn an ordinary summer night into something that requires sunglasses the following morning. Yet those places still tend to preserve a clear boundary between the city and the entertainment inside it. Vegas erases that boundary almost completely. Here, the city itself becomes the show. That difference matters during a global event such as the 2026 World Cup, when international visitors are already arriving in the United States prepared for spectacle. Las Vegas simply answers, how much spectacle did you have in mind? In recent years before 2026, the city was already welcoming more than 40 million visitors annually, according to Las Vegas tourism reporting. That number helps explain why the Strip feels less like a collection of resorts and more like an enormous human conveyor belt running on neon, air conditioning, and questionable decisions made after midnight. The city has spent decades learning how to entertain huge crowds without asking them to slow down. And this is where a common European image of America starts running into trouble. From abroad, American excess is often presented as something almost embarrassing. Too many lights, buildings too large, portions too generous, entertainment too commercial. Vegas takes every one of those accusations, puts them in a tuxedo, and sells front row tickets. Once visitors are standing inside that environment, too much starts becoming part of the fun, rather than a flaw that needs correcting. The genius is that modern Las Vegas no longer depends on gambling alone. Major concerts, professional sports, restaurants from celebrity chefs, conventions, shopping, and enormous resort complexes have turned the city into a playground where spending an entire weekend without touching a blackjack table is completely normal. The arrival of the NHL's Golden Knights and the NFL's Raiders strengthened that shift, while Formula One added another global event to a city that already treats ordinary weekends like somebody accidentally scheduled New Year's Eve. Compare that with many European capitals, where major entertainment is distributed across old districts, theaters, and stadiums woven into existing neighborhoods. London has the West End. Madrid has Gran Via. Paris has famous venues spread across a centuries-old urban fabric. Vegas does something far more American. It gathers the spectacle into one corridor and turns the volume knob until it comes off in your hand. That can be strangely addictive. You do not visit Vegas because it resembles everyday life. You visit because everyday life has clearly been asked to remain outside. And for European travelers who arrived in America after years of hearing that its love of scale was somehow proof of cultural shallowness, Las Vegas delivers a very different lesson. Sometimes bigger is simply more fun, especially when the whole city is willing to participate in the joke. By the time the lights come on and the sidewalks fill again, one thing becomes difficult to deny. America has turned entertainment into an art form that nobody else performs quite the same way. Hollywood gets crowded. Los Angeles has one particularly unfair advantage during a World Cup summer. Millions of Europeans arrive feeling as though they have already been here. They recognize the palm trees, the hillside letters, the Pacific sunsets, and those absurdly wide boulevards before the airplane door even opens. Because American movies have been quietly exporting Southern California into European living rooms for generations. Then reality does something far more interesting than the screen ever managed. The place is bigger, brighter, and much more alive than the 2-hour Hollywood version suggested. That familiarity is exactly what makes Los Angeles so addictive. Before 2026, the Los Angeles region was already receiving tens of millions of visitors in a typical year, with tourism authorities reporting roughly 49 million visitors in 2023. World Cup traffic therefore lands in a city that has spent decades turning global curiosity into an entire economy. The remarkable part is that Europeans are not simply coming to see locations from movies. They are coming to discover what those movies left outside the frame. This is where Los Angeles becomes a useful cultural comparison with Europe. Paris has spent centuries selling the romance of a compact city where cafes, monuments, and neighborhoods can be discovered block by block. Rome lets history practically trip pedestrians on the sidewalk. Los Angeles offers almost the opposite pleasure. Distance itself becomes part of the experience. Americans built Southern California around movement, and Europeans who initially joke about needing a car can eventually understand why that freedom has such appeal. Venice Beach in the morning, Koreatown for lunch, Griffith Observatory near sunset, and a game or concert later that evening can belong to one day, but those places do not politely sit beside each other like attractions on a European Old Town map. Los Angeles asks you to roam. For travelers from countries such as the Netherlands, where urban planning heavily favors bicycles and compact development, that scale can feel almost comic. A Dutch neighborhood might put groceries, a cafe, and public transportation within a short ride. Los Angeles sometimes looks at the same shopping list and hands you 6 freeway lanes. Yet this is where an old criticism of America becomes unexpectedly attractive. Space creates possibility. The American preference for larger homes, wider commercial districts, enormous sports venues, and expansive neighborhoods can sound wasteful when discussed academically. Living inside it feels different. There is room for Mexican food that has shaped the city for generations, Korean neighborhoods with their own late-night rhythm, Armenian communities, Japanese businesses, beach culture, studio culture, and suburban family life to exist without being compressed into one postcard-friendly center. That variety explains much more about the returning European crowds than Hollywood nostalgia alone. Los Angeles offers the peculiar feeling that changing neighborhoods can feel almost like changing countries without ever leaving the same metropolitan area. Southern California does not ask every district to look alike, and that messy freedom is very American. Even the famous freeway culture begins making emotional sense after several days. Europeans often hear American car dependence discussed almost entirely as a failure of planning, and Los Angeles certainly has traffic problems nobody needs to romanticize. But behind the frustration lies something culturally important. Americans place enormous value on deciding where they go, when they leave, and what they carry with them. A rental car filled with beach towels, shopping bags, and half-finished iced coffees may not look poetic, but it represents a kind of everyday independence that many visitors quickly learn to enjoy. Perhaps that is why Los Angeles can be so difficult to summarize after experiencing it. The city people heard about from overseas was supposedly artificial, sprawling, and obsessed with appearances. The city Europeans actually encounter during a packed World Cup summer is multicultural, energetic, and strangely personal once they find the neighborhood that suits them. Hollywood may have sold them the ticket, but everyday America gives them the reason to stay longer. And somewhere between the Pacific and one more freeway exit, 2 spread out can quietly turn into, we still haven't seen half of it. Orlando broke the scale. Some cities preserve history so beautifully that visitors whisper when they enter. Orlando took a completely different route and built places where grown adults willingly wear mouse ears at breakfast, sprint toward roller coasters before noon, and somehow consider walking 12 miles in Florida humidity a relaxing vacation. During the World Cup summer, that particular American talent becomes impossible for European visitors to ignore. The United States knows how to manufacture joy at an almost industrial scale. That is the one thing Orlando does better than nearly anywhere else. The contrast with Europe is fascinating because Europe already has excellent theme parks. Disneyland Paris is one of the continent's biggest tourist attractions, while Germany's Europa Park has developed an international reputation for elaborate themed lands and major roller coasters. Yet Orlando operates on another level of concentration. Walt Disney World alone covers roughly 25,000 acres, an area so large that comparing it with a conventional European attraction almost feels unfair. Add Universal Orlando, SeaWorld, water parks, resort hotels, shopping districts, and dozens of smaller attractions, and the city starts behaving less like a destination with theme parks than an entire regional economy built around making people say, "Okay, one more ride?" That scale explains why Orlando has become such a powerful magnet for overseas travelers. Visit Orlando reported about 74 million visitors in 2023, placing the city among the most visited destinations in the United States. The impressive part is not simply the number of people arriving, it is the machinery required to keep that many people entertained, fed, transported, and willing to return. Europe often gives travelers the pleasure of discovering attractions that history accidentally placed close together. In Rome, a church, a fountain, and a 2,000-year-old ruin can appear during the same afternoon walk because centuries stack themselves on top of one another. Orlando represents a wonderfully American reversal. Somebody looked at an empty piece of Florida and asked how much entertainment could be deliberately designed into it. Apparently the answer was, keep building until grandparents need a spreadsheet. The American difference lies in how seriously fun is treated as infrastructure. Hotels are connected to transportation systems, restaurants become theatrical experiences, waiting lines receive elaborate theming, and even parking lots require signs memorable enough to help exhausted parents locate a minivan 8 hours later. What sounds excessive from overseas begins making perfect sense once somebody's traveling with children, grandparents, bags, strollers, and enough sunscreen to qualify as cargo. This is also where one popular criticism of American culture becomes much harder to maintain. Europeans sometimes describe US entertainment as overly commercial because so much of it is intentionally designed rather than inherited through history. Orlando makes no apology for that artificiality, and perhaps that confidence is precisely why it works. Nobody enters a theme park believing the castle is medieval. The pleasure comes from seeing how convincingly thousands of designers, engineers, performers, and service workers can make an ordinary Tuesday feel like somebody upgraded reality for the afternoon. That cultural attitude can become surprisingly addictive. America rarely acts embarrassed about wanting people to enjoy themselves. There is always a larger refill, another attraction, a longer operating day, another hotel pool, another show after dinner. The experience is built around the assumption that vacation time is precious, so wasting it should almost be considered bad manners. For European visitors arriving during a World Cup trip, Orlando therefore becomes much more than a side excursion. It reveals a part of America that gloomy headlines almost never capture: the extraordinary amount of creativity, organization, and optimism required to build happiness for millions of strangers every year. A medieval European square can make someone admire the past. Orlando does something very American instead. It makes people excited about what humans can invent next. And that may explain why so many visitors arrive planning to stay 3 days, then discover that Florida has quietly stolen the rest of their itinerary. Chicago feels huge. Chicago plays a different trick on European visitors because it does not need neon theme parks or movie mythology to feel enormous. The city simply stands beside Lake Michigan, lifts a wall of skyscrapers into the sky, and lets geography do the bragging. During a packed World Cup summer, that combination becomes especially powerful because the crowds are not merely filling downtown streets. They are discovering how much open public space an American city can fit around a dense, urban core. That is Chicago's great surprise. European cities such as Paris, Milan, or Brussels can feel wonderfully compact because centuries of development push people, buildings, and streets closer together. Chicago grew under a different set of rules. Its famous grid, broad avenues, lakefront parks, and enormous shoreline create a sense of breathing room that can be hard to appreciate through photos alone. The skyline is dense, but the experience often is not. That balance is one reason the city can feel strangely addictive. According to Choose Chicago, the city welcomed more than 50 million visitors in 2023, showing that Chicago was already operating at global tourism scale well before the 2026 World Cup. What those numbers do not capture is how unusual the city can feel to someone arriving from inland Europe. Lake Michigan is technically a lake, but standing beside it does not feel remotely like visiting the neighborhood pond. It covers more than 22,000 square miles, large enough that the opposite shoreline disappears completely from view. For many first-time European visitors, that can be a genuine mental reset. A city like Zurich has Lake Zurich beautifully woven into urban life, while Geneva sits beside one of Europe's most famous lakes. Both are elegant, polished, and visually stunning. Chicago takes the same relationship between city and water and turns the scale knob several clicks farther. Beaches sit beneath skyscrapers, cyclists follow miles of shoreline, boats cross open blue water, and the horizon looks almost marine. It is the kind of thing Americans may take for granted until someone from abroad points out how unusual it really is. That generous scale also changes how public life feels. Millennium Park, Grant Park, and the lakefront give downtown Chicago something many older European centers struggle to provide in the same quantity: large stretches of public space directly beside major commercial districts, In cities such as Florence or Prague, historic density is part of the charm, but crowds can quickly fill narrow streets and squares. Chicago can absorb a huge event and still give people somewhere to spread out. That becomes especially important during World Cup season. Thousands of international fans can pour into downtown, and the city has room to turn that crowd into atmosphere rather than pure congestion. The difference is subtle, but powerful. People do not simply pass through Chicago. They linger beside the lake, sit in parks, walk the Riverwalk, or stop because the city keeps offering one more view that feels suspiciously expensive despite costing nothing. And perhaps that is one of America's most underrated urban strengths. The United States is often portrayed overseas through suburban sprawl and freeway footage, as though American cities somehow forgot how public space works. Chicago quietly destroys that assumption without needing a speech. It shows that American urbanism can be bold, generous, and deeply social, especially when the landscape is treated as part of the city rather than something outside it. There's also something very American about the confidence of the place. Chicago does not apologize for its scale or try to imitate Europe's intimacy. It lets the buildings rise high, the streets run straight, and the shoreline stretch farther than expected. That confidence is what stays with visitors. Some cities charm people because everything feels close enough to touch. Chicago wins them over by making them realize just how much city can fit inside one horizon. America feels older. Boston has a wonderfully mischievous way of confusing Europeans. They fly across the Atlantic expecting glass towers, interstate highways in a country that supposedly has no real history, then end up walking on brick streets beside buildings that were already old when several modern European nations had not yet taken their current political form. During the World Cup summer, with visitors crowding sidewalks in historic districts, Boston quietly turns one of the oldest cliches about America into the easiest joke in town. This city's special attraction is not size, nightlife, or engineered entertainment. It is how casually American history lives inside ordinary daily life. The Freedom Trail stretches roughly 5 miles through central Boston and connects 16 historic sites associated with the American Revolution and the country's early political development. That matters because history here is not locked inside one giant museum that visitors enter for 2 hours before returning to modern life. It sits beside restaurants, subway entrances, office buildings, and neighborhood streets. Someone can buy coffee, cross an intersection, and suddenly be standing near a place connected to events that helped create the United States. For European visitors, that arrangement can feel unexpectedly familiar. Edinburgh, York, and parts of London also layer modern businesses around historic streets, while Rome occasionally treats a 2,000-year-old ruin as though it were simply another neighbor who has been there forever. Boston obviously cannot compete with Europe in sheer age, and it does not need to. Its appeal comes from a different idea. American history may be shorter, but Americans have turned the story of their independence into a living civic landscape. That becomes especially meaningful during an international sporting event. European football culture is deeply connected to local identity. Liverpool, Dortmund, Naples, and Barcelona all show how a city can carry history through songs, colors, and neighborhood loyalties. Boston Americans understand that instinct immediately because civic pride here also runs hot. The same city that preserves Paul Revere and revolutionary history can fill arenas and ballparks with generations of families who treat local sports like inherited property. Boston therefore offers European visitors something surprisingly recognizable, wrapped in a distinctly American package: belonging. The United States is sometimes portrayed abroad as culturally young, rootless, and endlessly reinventing itself. Boston complicates that picture within a few blocks. Harvard was founded in 1636, Boston Common dates to 1634, and is generally recognized as the oldest public park in the United States. The Old State House was built in the 18th century. None of those dates will frighten Rome, obviously, where ancient stones have had more birthdays than anyone can count, but they make the phrase, "America has no history," sound increasingly lazy once you're standing there. The charm comes from what Americans do with that history. They do not always handle it with museum glass solemnity. Revolutionary figures appear on walking tours, pub signs, school lessons, souvenirs, and local jokes. The past is respected, but it is also allowed to remain part of everyday culture. In Europe, national history can sometimes feel formal, almost ceremonial. Boston makes parts of American history feel like an old family story that everybody has heard, argued over, teased, and somehow still wants to tell again. That warmth can be unexpectedly powerful for visitors who arrive mainly because of football. After days surrounded by international jerseys, hearing several languages on the same street, and watching foreign crowds move through places tied to the birth of the United States, Boston creates a striking picture. America suddenly looks less like a young country with no roots, and more like a country that remembers exactly where many of its roots were planted. And perhaps that is what becomes addictive here. Boston does not try to outage Europe. because that would be like challenging an Italian grandmother to a competition in family stories. It simply invites visitors into America's own story, gives them a red brick sidewalk to follow, and lets the city make its case one block at a time. Maybe the biggest surprise of this World Cup summer is not how crowded America has become, but how many visitors arrived carrying one picture of the country and are leaving with another. Once the headlines fade behind real streets, real conversations, and real everyday life, America becomes harder to reduce to a stereotype. If you saw your city packed with overseas fans, tell us what they seem to love most. And subscribe for more stories about America through fresh eyes.